Hello and welcome to this PIR Live Event webinar brought to you in part by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Ben Hobbs and I will be your host today. If you're joining us live, remember that you can ask questions at any time by clicking Q&A located near the bottom center of your Zoom window and typing your questions into the pop-up window. I will relay these to our guests during the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you see a question someone has asked that you would also like the answer to, you can prioritize it by clicking the thumbs up icon just below their question. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest today, Dr. Jennifer Foote, Associate Professor of Biology at Algoma University. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Foote. I'll let you take it from here.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. Today I'm going to talk to you about animal migration, and I have a little slideshow I've prepared to share with you that will tell you a little bit about animal migration and what I do to study bird migration here in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and elsewhere across Ontario. So we should think about why animals migrate if we're going to talk about migration. And animals migrate to do things that they need to do, like find food. So they'll move to places where there's more food than the place where they were presently. They'll also move to find better weather. So we know that it gets cold in Canada in the winter. Many animals will leave to go to warmer places. And also to find good places to breed where there's, again, lots of food. So all of these things relate to survival. So animals migrate in order to survive. So what kind of animals migrate? When you think about migration, you probably think about one typical group, which are birds, which are currently migrating back to Canada from places further south. But lots of other animals migrate too. So butterflies and other insects like dragonflies can make very long migration. Bats migrate as well. Whales, fish and sharks, and large herds of herbivores like caribou. So there's a lot of different kinds of animals that migrate. And so what I'll do is introduce you to an example of each type of group, and then we'll look at ways that we can monitor animal migration. So one insect that is famous for its migration is the monarch butterfly. Many of you have probably heard of or seen monarch butterflies because they're a species that we're concerned about their survival because we've lost many monarch butterflies from the larger population. So here in the top, you can see this picture of monarchs flying. They migrate in the fall from Canada up here in the United States all the way down to Mexico, where they gather in huge numbers along big trees like these ones and spend the winter. Then in the spring, they'll return to the United States and to Canada to breed before repeating that cycle again. So butterflies like the monarch are a good example of a migratory species that moves to a warmer climate for the winter and then comes north to a place where there's lots of food to breed in the summertime. Birds are another great example. You might see the dots are moving on our map here. So here we're presently moving into March, April, and May. These are 118 species. You can see that they're reaching the areas where they're going to stay for the summer and breed. And then in August, we see they're starting to move back towards southern locations. So each dot in this figure is a species. And so you can see that different species migrate to different places. And so some go further south than others, and some breed further north than others. So each of these species has its own migratory pathway that it follows. We'll talk a little bit later about how it's able to follow the correct path to get where it's trying to go. A good example of a herbivore that makes a large migration in a group is the caribou. So here I've put a map showing the different herds of caribou that we have in Canada. So we have many different caribou herds, and they migrate in large numbers from areas where they spend the summer and where they eat there to areas where they spend the winter, which are usually a little bit further south. So here's a map from just one herd. The arrows that are blue show the direction that they head in the fall to spend the winter, and the red arrows show where they go for the summertime. So these guys are way up here in Alaska and in Canada on the other side of the border, and you can see that they're making very large movements as a group. Here's a nice example of humpback whales across the world migrating. So they migrate in groups as well, often family groups of parents and young. Our pink dots here show the breeding ground. So this is warmer waters where the humpback whales go, either from the very far south, they move north, or from the north, they move south. And so in this area, the water's warm. And so when the calves are born, it's nice and warm for them, and that helps them to survive. But there's actually more fish in the northern waters than there is in the southern waters. So the humpback whales then move north or south to these areas where there's lots of fish, which are their feeding grounds. So they'll spend most of the year there eating fish, just returning to the warmer waters in the summer to have their calves. So how are our animals migrating? Well, the answer is going to be different for different species. But in general, there are a few categories of signals that the animals use to tell them where to go. For animals that migrate during the daytime, they often use the position of the sun. So they can use that position to tell them which way is north and which way is south. In the night, animals that migrate in the darkness use the North Star, which stays fixed in position as the other constellations move around, to travel in the right direction. Another thing that animals use to migrate are things that we use when we move. So if you're traveling from your home to your school, maybe walking or biking, you might use landmarks to make sure you go the right way. So at the street crossing, you know you might have to turn right instead of going across to get to school. And that's a landmark. Or you might use a street sign. So Smith Street might be where you're going to stop and turn to go towards your school. So those are landmarks that we use, and animals use landmarks as well. So those landmarks might be large mountains, but sometimes they're even things that we've built, like buildings that these animals are using. Another thing that animals can use is the magnetic field of the earth. So they're able to sense that. So migrating birds and even migrating fish and sharks are able to sense that field and be able to tell which direction to travel. And the last one is something that we use typically at a shorter scale, which is olfaction, or our sense of smell. So things like fish, some fish that move out to the ocean to grow and then will return to the rivers in order to have their young, they'll be able to recognize the smell of the individual river that they want to go back to. So they can follow that sense of smell to find their way back. So here's a nice picture showing us how a bird might migrate. So in this case, it's a dove or a pigeon, and it's using different things to tell it where to go at different distances. So when it's still a long way from where it wants to go, it's probably using the position of the sun and the magnetic field of the earth to tell it which way to fly. As it gets closer to home at the medium distance, it might use smells that it recognizes, or things like highways that it can see that we've built. And then when it gets close to home, it's going to use individual landmarks. So pigeons like to nest in cities. So this pigeon might be using a couple of different buildings to be their landmarks, and they'll use those buildings in the near distance to find their home. So birds can navigate using all of these different things that we have on this picture. And one thing we should think about is that traveling long distance requires a lot of energy. So if you've ever gone for a really, really long walk, you know that you probably got quite hungry and you might have brought some snacks along for the way. The way that birds bring snacks along for the way, and other animals, is they store fat to use as fuel while they're flying or walking these long distances. So they often time their migrations to arrive at places where they can refuel those fat stores with lots of food. So one of the most famous examples of this are shorebirds, like these red knots we can see in the picture. They arrive in Chesapeake Bay in the United States at the exact time that this horseshoe crab that you can see in the front is laying its eggs. And those birds feast on those eggs, and they build up lots of fat to allow them to keep flying all the way up to the Arctic. So having lots of energy is important. You need to have a place to refuel along the way. Now, how do we study migration as scientists? So I'm a scientist. I'll show you one way that I study migration, but there's lots of different ways that we can do this. And I'll give you an example of each. So the first one is bird banding. The second is radar. The third are radio tags and geolocators, and also satellites. And then we use sound recording, which is actually the one that I will use. So I'll show you an example of each of these things. So first, bird banding. So birds will often funnel through particular areas in large numbers because sometimes they like to avoid flying over the open water. So wherever we have a nice point of land that's going out into the water, we'll end up getting lots of migratory birds showing up there. So what we do at these banding stations that we put in these areas is we stretch out these long nets that are very invisible to the eye as long as the sun's not shining too brightly, and the birds fly into these nets. Then we carefully take them out and we bring them into a banding station and we add these bands to their legs. So you can see this water thrush right here has a little silver band on its leg. And that bird's band has a number on it that only that bird has. And then if anybody catches that bird in another place, we're able to know that it passed through the first place where we caught it and then also the next place where we caught it. Sometimes we include extra bands like these colors on this piping plover. And those colors allow us to identify the individual from a distance. So piping plovers are an endangered species that we have here in the Great Lakes region. And we ask people to try to sight them when they go to their wintering grounds around Florida and Cuba and the Bahamas to try to figure out where they're spending their winter. So these color bands allow people to take pictures of them and send them back to researchers in Canada and the United States. So radar is actually something we use to track storms. You can see down here, this is Florida, this big green swirling mass is actually a hurricane forming. All these other little spots here that we see across the map are actually clusters of migrating birds. So they show up on our weather radar. And so we can get an idea of how many birds are flying at different points in time by looking at these radar maps. Our radio tags are things that we actually attach to the bird. So you can see this Swainson's thrush right here has this little tag on its bum that has been attached there carefully with a little radio antenna. And so what happens is their little tag emits a radio signal, just like our radio stations do. And then in this map here, each of these blue dots is a tower that looks like this. It's a tracking station. And the bird's radio signal hits those towers, and it's going to hit several towers at a time, which allow us to figure out where that bird was at any particular time. We're even able to make tags so small that we can track monarch butterflies, like people were doing in this map here. So the two arrows show us the track of two individual butterflies that are flying. The way we usually do radio tagging, or we used to do it, is we'd have to go out with a radio tag receiver and try to walk around and try to find the birds. But these towers are really cool because they allow us to do this across a big time scale that we wouldn't be able to follow the birds because they move so fast. Geolocators are about the same size as radio tags, but they don't use a radio signal. What they do is they have a little receptor that senses the amount of light that's coming in. And at different places, there's different amounts of day length. So here in Canada, in the spring, our days are getting longer, but in the tropics, the days are relatively stable in length. So what we can do is when we recapture those birds, we take those geolocators off and we go and look at them, we can see the tracks that those birds took based on the amount of light that was in their environment. So we can see this blackpoll warbler left here on the 25th of September, and it arrived down here where it spent the entire winter on the 8th of October. That's actually a pretty quick amount of time for a bird so small to travel such a long distance. Satellite tracking uses the satellites that are circling above the Earth to track animals. Right now, these tags are a little bit too big for birds, but we can use them to study things like sharks and whales, which are much larger. So anytime that they're near the surface, that tag will be located by the satellites, and we can look at how that animal moves. So each of these green dots in the map would be a location of that particular animal at a particular point in time. So all of these new technologies are allowing us to learn more and more about how animals are migrating. The last thing I wanted to talk about is that we can use the sounds that animals make as they're migrating in order to track their migration. So this is a project that I've been working on where I use these microphones that you can see here. I've got one to show you right here. They point up at the sky. The microphone is here in the middle, and this big plate here helps reflect any sounds that are coming down from the air onto our microphone. We hook those microphones up to these recorders here that run by batteries. And so because the birds are flying at night, we tell our recorder to wake up just before it gets dark and then turn off right before it gets light every single day during the migration season. So that allows me to be in many places at once, whereas if I had to go out with a microphone in my hand, I would never be able to collect so many sounds of recording of birds flying over. So the sounds that the birds make actually look like this. I'm going to play it for you. And you probably maybe could hear it or barely hear it. It's very quiet. So this is the song that the sound the white-throated sparrow makes when it's flying over. And the neat thing is that each species has a different type of call. So here I have 3 species of nocturnal flying birds. The American redstart's the first one, the ovenbird's the second, and the magnolia warbler is the third. And you can see that when we make an image of those sounds on the computer, they actually look quite different. So we can look at one of the recordings I make and we can say how many different individuals of all these different species fly over and try to figure out when they migrate and what sort of weather conditions they migrate during. So that is the work that I do on animal migration. So I'm going to stop there and let you guys ask me some questions about animal migration.
Well, thank you, Dr. Foote. Just before we move into the Q&A today, I'd like to remind those classrooms that are joining us live to direct their questions to the Q&A, which is located in the bottom center of your Zoom window. So our first question today comes from Mr. Hickey's grade 1 classroom, and they are wondering what happens if the monarchs can't make it to Canada, and what can we do to help them?
Okay, well, the monarchs are really neat because what happens is monarchs leave Mexico and then they stop in the United States first. Then they lay eggs. Those eggs turn into caterpillars. Those caterpillars turn into adult monarchs, and those monarchs then fly up to Canada. So usually the monarchs are able to make it to Canada because it's not just one individual that makes it the whole way. It's actually 2 generations of monarch butterflies that come this far. However, if the weather is really bad, there's strong winds and a storm when the monarchs are flying, that can be big trouble for the monarchs and can keep some of them from making it to Canada. So what we can do to help them is just make sure that the ones that do make it to Canada have lots of food to eat. And monarch butterflies eat something called milkweed, which many people consider a weed species, but is actually a naturally growing plant that we have here in Canada. So you can get milkweed seeds, or you can collect them from places where you find milkweed pods in the fall, and you can plant those in your yard and make sure that there's some habitat for those butterflies and some food when they come back to Canada.
How do you put those trackers on the birds, or maybe even the monarchs, considering that they're even smaller?
So the monarchs are very tiny. I think they actually just glue them to their abdomens. For the birds, what we do is we make a little harness with thread that's like a figure 8, and it actually goes down over their legs, and that just holds it on their back. So special harness.
Our next question comes from Lincoln, and he's wondering how many monarch butterflies typically travel together in a migratory group?
Well, I don't think we really know a great answer to that question yet because we aren't able to see them. But from the images that I've found, when people have found a bunch of butterflies, it can be tens of thousands of butterflies flying together. But sometimes butterflies will also fly in smaller groups.
Do we know of any species of birds that don't migrate?
Yes. So if you have black-capped chickadees in your backyard, they're a species that don't migrate. And how they cope with the winter is that they actually form groups of between 4 or 5 and up to 12 chickadees. And so together they move around and find food, and more eyes is better than just one set. So they're able to survive by cooperating in the wintertime. Now in the summertime, they split off into pairs of males and females, just like the birds that migrate here.
So our next question comes from Miss Goss's grade 3 classroom, and they're wondering, number 1, how long have you been a scientist? And number 2, how long have you studied night flights?
Okay, so I started training to be a scientist when I went to my undergraduate degree, and I then did a master's and a PhD, which meant I went to school for 10 years to be a scientist, and I've now been working at Algoma University for 9 years. And I've been studying night flight calls for about 4 years now.
What happens if a bird isn't able to make it the entire way of the migration?
So some birds will stay where they are if they don't make it all the way, and they might survive. Some birds might die if they don't make it and it's too cold for them to find food. But sometimes we have birds that in Sault Ste. Marie that people who are out bird watching will see for the winter that should be in the south, and they actually manage to make it. So things like American robins, they usually fly quite a bit further south, but now and then 1 or 2 will end up staying here in the winter. We don't really know why they're staying, but if they can find enough berries and things like that to eat, they'll survive until the spring.
Is there ever instances where animals give birth during migration?
I believe some of the animals that in the herds, like the caribou and the antelopes, they will sometimes give birth during migration. Birds, of course, don't. They actually don't lay their eggs until they return to where they're waiting. And I think sometimes some whales might actually breed and then they are moving back to their wintering grounds when they actually give birth to the calves.
Spencer is wondering how long a typical migration takes for the monarch butterflies.
For the monarch butterflies, I believe in the winter when they fly south, it takes several weeks. I'm not exactly sure how many weeks. We might have to look that up in the classroom after. But in the spring, because they have 2 generations on the way here, it takes several months for them to get here.
What is the longest migration that you know of, at least?
That I know of? Okay, let me just check. I had some extra slides just in case I was too fast with some great one. The longest known insect migration is a globe skimmer dragonfly, and it flies 14,000 to 18,000 kilometers, but it takes 4 generations for it to get there. The Arctic tern is probably the most impressive bird. It flies 71,000 kilometers in a year. And if it lives for 30 years, that means it flies 2.4 million kilometers in its lifetime.
Wow, that's quite impressive.
Quite impressive.
So we already talked about how you get the trackers on the monarchs and the birds, but what about whales and sharks? And does this process hurt them at all?
So researchers are very careful to make sure they work out ways of catching animals that are the least stressful and harmful as possible. So I think for some whales and for sharks, they're actually able to use like a dart gun to hit them with their satellite tags. So it hurts a little bit as it almost like when you get a needle at the doctor. But that way they don't have to capture the animals. And then other times you might have to capture the animal in order to do that. But what we try to do is do it as quickly as possible. So try to capture the animal very carefully and then spend, as little time as possible as you can holding them, and then let them go as soon as possible. But one important thing we do as researchers is we always try to check that our methods are working. So after we capture an animal to do something to it, we make sure that we re-site it very shortly afterwards, and we monitor how it's doing and make sure it's doing okay. And if we start to see that there might be a problem with any of the methods we're using, then we try to find ways to change things right away as fast as we can to minimize any harm that we do to animals. But the important thing is that I think the benefits of knowing more about the way these animals migrate will help those species in the long run, because it allows us to figure out where the important areas that they're spending their time is, so that we can conserve those habitats. And sometimes we don't know those things about species, especially those ones that live in the oceans.
The Joshua Creek grade ones are wondering, how do birds get through storms while they're migrating?
Okay, so birds are very good at telling if a storm is coming. So they're able to tell if the pressure's changing in the air, which happens before a storm. And so what they'll do is they'll land and they'll stop migrating during the storm. And so during storms, birds will usually choose trees that are really bushy, like evergreen trees, like cedars that we might have hedges of in our backyards. And they'll put themselves in those trees in the direction opposite the wind is blowing, so that when the wind blows, they're protected by the tree trunk from that wind. So what they'll do is they'll wait out their migration, and then they'll start flying again once it's better. And that's why in Canada, sometimes we expect certain species to show up at certain points in time, and they're a little bit late. And if we look at what's happening further south in the United States, we'll often see that there's been a big band of storms that lasted for a long time that made our birds late to arrive to Canada.
The grade 1 and 2s at Grant McEwen are wondering, how did you think to begin tracking nocturnal flights with a microphone?
Okay, well, that's a good question. Well, people have been interested in the night flight calls of birds for a long time, but we didn't always know why they were doing it or how often birds were doing that. So I study bird song during the daytime and also even at night, of birds that have already migrated to where I'm living. So I thought it would be interesting to get involved in a project looking at that. And so I just have one extra slide that I didn't share with you that I can share my screen here and show you that might help answer that question. So we were interested in looking at across the Great Lakes region, how birds were flying, and whether we could see evidence that they were tracking along the edge of the lake shore, following kind of a path like this. So we actually put out 20 different microphones all across the Great Lakes region, and we're currently still sifting through all the hundreds of thousands of calls that we recorded during that time. But we're interested in one of the questions you asked about weather, trying to figure out how birds change their behavior around big storms. So we look to see if after a big storm we get lots of calls compared to the time during the storm or even just before the storm when the birds might be waiting it out. So I had the idea that it might be interesting to look at migration all across Ontario using these microphones.
Do we know of any instances where birds of different species migrate together?
Yes, I think in a lot of cases, birds that are fairly similar migrate together. So when we have those microphones up in the air, we'll often get many warbler species, which are small birds that nest in the forests in Canada, flying together. So like those 3 species I showed that had different songs or different sounds that they made, those would be 3 warblers, and they might fly together. Sometimes you'll see large flocks of raptors, so things like hawks and eagles flying over together, and they're not always the same species. There's often a mix of species. And we see the same thing with ducks. So if you see many times you'll see the same type of duck flying over all together, but sometimes you'll see a mixed group where you have a couple of different species. So those are things to look for right now, because there's lots of birds flying over most of our heads right now.
McKenna is wondering, how long have we been tagging birds and animals for?
Okay, well, I know the answer for bird banding because that's one we've been doing probably for the longest. People have been banding birds since the 1800s. So using homemade rings that they would have made at that point in Europe. So the Europeans were the ones to really start banding birds. And there's many locations where we've been banding birds at the same place for over 100 years, which means that we have lots of information about those birds and how common they were before and then how common they are now passing through those places.
We're almost out of time for today, but before I end, I was hoping to have you speak a little bit about your career path and maybe some advice you have for students who are watching today, considering something similar for themselves.
Sure. I was always interested in science when I was young, but I actually thought I wanted to be a doctor because when I was studying in school, I didn't know that you could do anything else. And I just knew I really liked biology, and people who did biology often ended up being doctors. So it wasn't until I went to university and I took lots of different classes in different areas of biology that I realized you could do different things. And I was really excited by the fact that I could study animals outside in the environment. And so that was very exciting for me. And I got really into ecology, which is studying the animals and their association with their environment. And then I went on to do a master's studying birds, and then a PhD studying chickadees and how they sing. And then I ended up getting a job as a professor, which I wasn't even sure what I wanted to do. I kind of just followed the path as it appeared to me. I think my advice would be to follow what you're interested in, because it's something I always tell my students, to pick things that you're interested in, because if you like what you're doing, you'll always do well in that area. Versus if you're doing something just because you think you should do it, but it's not really your passion, you might struggle a little bit more. And that there's lots of opportunities for kids who want to be scientists. You can start by just watching the birds in your backyard and learning to identify them. There's a good website called allaboutbirds.org, which is by Cornell University. They have little bits of information about all the birds you would find in your yard. So you can learn about them, learn to identify them, and keep notebooks of what species you see, and just learn to observe the world around you, which is the best way to be a scientist.
That's all the time we have for today, but thank you, Dr. Foote, for taking the time to talk to us today and for answering all of our questions.
Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something about animal migration and that you'll have some questions to research yourself.
Next time on PIR Live Event, Dr. Michelle De Souza from the University of Guelph will join us to discuss how they're bringing together rangers and scientists to better understand the insects of South Africa. More information about these webinars and other PIR educational programs are available at pirweb.org. Thanks for tuning in and have a wonderful day.